Chronicles of Christ, the empty tomb. Nobody saw it happen. I want to start there because it's the single strangest fact about the most important morning in the Christian story, and almost nobody says it out loud. The resurrection, the hinge the entire faith swings on, the event without which, as Paul bluntly admits, the whole thing is a waste of everyone's Sunday, has no eyewitness. Not one. Open all four Gospels, read every line, and you will not find a sentence that begins, "And this is what it looked like when he rose." There's no description. No slow motion, no angelic color commentary, no trumpet, no camera. The most consequential thing these writers believe ever happened is the one thing not a single one of them claims to have watched. What they give you instead is the after. A stone rolled back from a door whose one job was to stay shut. Strips of linen lying there like a cocoon with nobody home. A face cloth folded off by itself. A woman weeping in a garden who turns around and mistakes God Almighty for the groundskeeper. That's the evidence. Not a photograph of the resurrection, the outline where the resurrection used to be standing. And here is the first thing I want to press on you because it runs against every instinct a nervous believer has. That absence is not a weakness in the story. It's a fingerprint of its honesty. Think about it for a second. If you were inventing a religion, if you sat down with a blank scroll and every motive in the world to sell it, you would not stage the climax off stage. You'd put a camera on it. You'd have 10,000 witnesses, a chorus of angels, and Pilate himself fainting dead away at the sight. What you would absolutely not do is have the tomb discovered by a couple of grief-wrecked women, at least one of whom, in the earliest account we possess, is so terrified she tells nobody anything at all. So let's do something the flannel graph version of this story never does. Let's actually look at the evidence, all of it, the tidy parts and the awkward parts, the canonical and the buried, the stuff your Sunday school teacher loved and the stuff she skipped. Because I've spent a good while now down in the sources, and I can tell you, the real morning is stranger, messier, and about 400% more interesting than the version on the felt board. Come look with me. 4 witnesses who can't keep their story straight. Let's begin with the thing defenders of the faith usually rush past with their eyes closed. The 4 gospel accounts of that morning do not line up, and I don't mean in some subtle seminary way. I mean if you took them into a courtroom and put them on the stand one at a time, opposing counsel would have a field day. How many women went to the tomb? Mark says 3 and names them. Matthew says 2. Luke says a whole crowd: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others. John says 1, Mary Magdalene all by herself, though even John slips because his solitary Mary runs back and says, "We don't know where they've laid him." We plural, a little grammatical thread hanging off the sweater, hinting there were others there after all. How many angels and where? Mark, 1 young man sitting inside. And notice Mark doesn't even call him an angel. He says a young man in a white robe and leaves you to work it out. Matthew, 1 angel and a dramatic one who descends in an earthquake, rolls the stone back himself and sits on it like a man settling onto a park bench while the guards faint. Luke, 2 men dazzling. John, 2 angels in white, seated at the head and the foot of the empty slab like bookends. Was the sun up? Mark says the sun had risen. John says it was still dark. Those are, I'm fairly sure, opposites. Now the honest preacher has 2 bad options here, and I'm going to refuse both. Option 1 is to panic and pretend the differences aren't there, which is lying, and God is not honored by lying on his behalf. Option 2 is the old skeptic's move. Aha, contradictions, therefore the whole thing's rubbish, pass the brunch menu. But that's lazy too, and here's why. Ask any detective, any judge, anyone who's ever taken statements from 4 people who witnessed the same car accident. When 4 accounts match word for word, comma for comma, you don't think how reliable, you think how rehearsed. Perfect agreement is the fingerprint of collusion, of witnesses who sat in a room and got their story straight. Real testimony from real people, rattled by a real and bewildering event, is always a little ragged at the edges. Everybody agrees on the thing that seared itself in. The tomb was open, the body was gone, they were told he was alive, and everybody remembers the trim a little differently. Who got there first? How many figures in white? Whether the light had come up yet? That's what we've got. 4 accounts that agree completely on the earthquake at the center and disagree on the weather at the edges. I'm not going to smooth it out for you. A great many good men have tried. Augustine wrote a whole treatise 1600 years ago doing exactly that, arguing that if you just assume 2 angels and only one of them talked, and several women arriving in shifts, it all clicks together. Maybe, but I think the seams are more honest than the stitching. I'd rather hand you 4 witnesses who clearly didn't coordinate than 1 suspiciously seamless press release. 4 ragged, unrehearsed, stubbornly disagreeing on the details accounts of an empty grave that, in the evidence business, is what authentic looks like. The gospel that stops mid-sentence. Now I have to show you something about Mark, the earliest of the 4, because it's one of the great strange facts of the New Testament and hardly anybody in the pews has been told it. Mark's gospel in the oldest copies we have doesn't end with a resurrection appearance. It doesn't end with Jesus at all. It ends with the women running from the empty tomb and this line, "And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And then nothing. That's the last verse. The women are terrified. They tell no one the end. It gets stranger. In the original Greek, that final sentence stops on the word gar, a little connecting word that means for, the kind of word that's supposed to have something after it. It's as if a book in English ended with the words because and then just stopped. Grammatically, it's like a staircase with the top step missing. Scholars have argued for centuries about it. Some think the real ending got lost, the last leaf of the scroll torn off, worn away, gone. Others think Mark did it on purpose, that he ended on fear and a missing step deliberately because he wanted to hand the reader the pen. The women fled and said nothing, so the only way the story ever got told is if, somewhere off the page, the fear didn't get the last word. Mark stops the sentence and looks at you. Well, he says, you finish it. But my Bible has 12 more verses, you're thinking, with the appearances and the Great Commission. It does, and I have to be straight with you about them because this is precisely the kind of thing this room is for. Those last 12 verses of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, are almost certainly a later addition. They're missing from our two oldest and best complete manuscripts. And this isn't some modern debunker's discovery, some 19th century German with a grudge. Eusebius knew, writing in the early 300s, he said the accurate copies ended before those verses, that you'd only find them rarely in some. Jerome knew, he said flat out, that almost all the Greek copies lacked the passage. The ancient church, the guys copying these texts by candlelight and revering every syllable, could see the ending had been patched. The vocabulary isn't even Mark's. Somebody early on found that staircase with the missing top step unbearable and built a step. And listen, I understand the impulse completely. It's the same impulse that filled the wordless scream at the crucifixion with borrowed words. Human beings cannot stand an unfinished sentence. But I'll tell you a small, slightly wicked footnote, because it's a good lesson in what happens when you build on a shaky step. Tucked into that added ending is a line about how true believers will pick up serpents and drink deadly poison unharmed. And to this day, up in a few hollows of Appalachia, there are churches where people handle live rattlesnakes in the middle of worship, staking their lives, quite literally, on 12 verses that the oldest Bibles don't contain. Be careful which steps you build on. Some of them weren't there to begin with. The rumor that gives the game away. Here's a piece of evidence I love because it comes from the opposition, and evidence from a hostile witness is worth 10 from a friendly one. Matthew tells us that after the tomb was found empty, the authorities had a problem and they solved it with cash. They paid the guards to say, his disciples came at night and stole the body while we were sleeping. And then Matthew adds this needle of a line, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. To this day. Matthew is writing 50 years after the fact, and he's telling you the rival explanation is still in circulation in his own neighborhood. And it kept circulating. 100 years or so after the crucifixion, a Christian named Justin is having a long argument with a Jewish teacher named Trypho, and he complains that the authorities in Jerusalem sent chosen and ordained men throughout all the world to spread the word that Jesus' disciples stole him by night from the tomb and now go around deceiving people by claiming he rose. A whole coordinated messaging campaign. Chosen men dispatched everywhere with a single talking point. Now sit with what that campaign is actually admitting. If your best counterargument is they stole the body, then you and I are already agreed the body is gone. Nobody sends ordained men across the empire to explain the absence of a corpse that's lying right there in the tomb where you can point at it. The stolen body rumor is not a denial of the empty tomb, it's a concession of it. Two ferociously opposed camps, the earliest Christians and their earliest opponents, standing on opposite sides of the same open grave, both looking in, both seeing the same nothing and arguing only about why it's empty. That's a remarkable thing to be able to say about an event this old. The hole in the ground, both sides grant. It's the reason for the hole they'll come to blows over. So let's take the alternatives seriously, genuinely, not as straw men, because if you can't state your opponent's best case, you don't get to claim you've beaten it. They stole the body. All right, then the disciples went on to be tortured and executed, one after another, for what they'd have known for a fact was a hoax they cooked up themselves. People die for things they wrongly believe to be true all the time. People do not generally line up to be crucified upside down for a body they're pretty sure they buried in a ditch. The women went to the wrong tomb, an honest suggestion, first floated seriously a century ago. Maybe in the half-light, but then Peter went to the wrong tomb too, and the authorities, who'd have loved to end the whole business by walking everyone over to the right tomb and pointing at the body, somehow never did. Jesus never really died, he passed out and revived in the cool of the tomb. This one at least has a certain novelistic charm, until you remember what a Roman flogging in 6 hours on a cross does to a human body. A team of doctors went through the medical evidence in a journal article back in the 80s and concluded what any honest coroner would. The man was dead. And even if you weren't, picture it, a half-killed man, unbandaged, exsanguinated, shoving aside a quarter-ton stone from the inside and then convincing his friends he'd conquered death. He'd have needed a stretcher, not a coronation. I'm not telling you these theories are stupid. I'm telling you they've been tried seriously by serious people, and they buckle under the weight, every one of them heavier and stranger than the thing it was invented to avoid. What the oldest words don't say. But now I have to turn around and show you the other side of the ledger, because if I only ever handed you the comforting half, I'd be a salesman, not a teacher, and this room has never been for salesmen. Here's the awkward one. The very oldest written account of the resurrection we possess is not in the Gospels. It's older than all of them. It's a few lines in one of Paul's letters, 1 Corinthians, where Paul quotes something he says he received and handed on, the technical language of a memorized creed, a formula already worn smooth by repetition before Paul ever got hold of it. Scholars across the spectrum, believing and skeptical alike, date the core of it to within just a few years of the crucifixion, which makes it, by a wide margin, the earliest resurrection testimony in existence, practically still warm. And here's what it says: that Christ died, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, and that he appeared to Peter, to the 12, to 500 at once, to James, to Paul himself. Read it and something jumps out, or rather something doesn't. There's no empty tomb in it, no women, no stone, no angels, no garden, no folded cloth. The oldest account we have skips the entire scene we've spent this whole chronicle on and goes straight from buried to appeared. I could hide that from you. A lot of preachers do. I'm not going to, because a faith that needs you kept in the dark to survive isn't worth your Sunday. So let's put it honestly on the table. Does buried then raised imply an empty tomb? Some very fine scholars say obviously yes. You don't say a buried man was raised and mean his corpse stayed put. The tomb being empty is baked into the words. Other equally serious scholars say, not so fast. Paul elsewhere talks about a spiritual body. And maybe the earliest faith was fixed entirely on the appearances, on the overwhelming experience that Jesus was alive and with them, and the empty tomb story came into focus a little later. That's a real debate. I lean toward the first reading, but I'm not going to pretend the second one is dishonest, because it isn't. And I'll go further and hand you a fact that the most rigorous defenders of the resurrection hand out themselves, to their great credit. There's a school of Christian scholarship that builds its whole case on what it calls the minimal facts, only the handful of points that just about every historian, friend, or foe will grant. And here's the thing that ought to make you sit up. The empty tomb is not on their list. They leave it off, on purpose. Because by their own honest reckoning it doesn't command the near-universal agreement their other points do. They figure something like 2/3 to 3/4 of critical scholars accept it, which is a lot, but it isn't everybody, so out it comes. Think about the integrity of that. These are people arguing for the resurrection, and they voluntarily set down one of their favorite pieces of evidence because it isn't quite strong enough to meet their own bar. That is what it looks like when someone would rather be right than merely persuasive. I'd trust a man who argues like that over a man with an airtight case and shifty eyes any day of the week. So where does that leave us? It leaves us exactly where honest history has to leave us, and I want to name the line very precisely because everything depends on it. There are two different claims here, and they are not the same size. One is the tomb was empty. That's a claim about a body's absence from a location, the kind of thing history can actually chew on, weigh, argue about, and as it happens, a fair number of skeptical historians end up granting. The other claim is God raised him. That one is of a different order entirely. No amount of manuscript work or archaeology can walk you the last step from the tomb was empty to therefore God did it. History can bring you right up to the mouth of the tomb. It cannot tell you what came out of it. At the door, history sets down its tools, not because it's failed, but because you've reached the edge of what its tools were ever built to measure. The women nobody would have invented. Let me give you back one solid thing to stand on, though, before we close, because I've been honest about the soft ground, and there's some genuinely hard ground here too, and it's hiding in a detail so obvious you've probably read past it 100 times. The first witnesses were women. In every single account, through all the disagreement about how many and what time and how many angels, the one thing all four Gospels agree on is that the people who found the tomb empty and the first person to meet the risen Christ were women. And I need you to understand what that would have meant to a first-century audience, because it's the opposite of what it means to us. In that world, a woman's testimony was worth very little. It often wasn't admissible in a court of law at all. We can hear it in their own mouths. The historian Josephus, writing in that very century, casually lays down the rule, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted," on account, he says, of the levity and boldness of their sex. That's the culture these accounts were born into and had to survive in. Now put your inventor's hat back on. You're constructing a story you need the ancient world to believe. You need witnesses whose word will hold up, carry weight, shut down the skeptics. Are you in that world going to build your entire case on the testimony of women? You would sooner cut your own legs off. If the early church had been free to invent this scene, they'd have had it discovered by Peter, by John, by respected men whose word meant something in a courtroom. The very last thing a fabricator would do is make the whole resurrection rest on witnesses his own culture would wave away. Unless, of course, that's simply how it happened and they were stuck with it. Unless the women found the tomb because the women were the ones who showed up, the ones who'd stayed at the cross when the men scattered, who came at dawn with their spices to do the last sad work of love for a corpse. You don't invent an inconvenient fact. You report one because you're not free to do otherwise. And the deep irony, the one I can't help savoring, is that the detail most likely to make an ancient skeptic sneer is, for exactly that reason, the detail a modern historian finds hardest to explain away. The embarrassment is the evidence. While we're on details and honesty, let me clear one bit of pious clutter off the table, because a teacher who won't correct a nice-sounding error isn't much of a teacher. You may have heard a lovely sermon about that folded facecloth in the tomb, how in Jewish custom a servant folded his master's napkin to signal, "I'm coming back." And so the folded cloth was Jesus' quiet promise of return. It's a beautiful little illustration. It is also, I'm sorry to report, completely made up. There's no such custom in any ancient source anybody can produce. The Greek just says the cloth was rolled or folded up and set apart from the others. That's all. The tidy grave cloths tell you something real, that this was no frantic grave robbery. Thieves don't stop to fold the linens, but they don't carry a secret napkin code. I'd rather give you the true, smaller thing than the false, prettier one. The truth doesn't need our help. It never has. At the mouth of the tomb. So here's where we come out. We've got a morning with no eyewitness and 4 witnesses who can't agree on the weather. An earliest gospel that stops mid-sentence and hands you the pen. A rival rumor that gives away more than it denies. An oldest creed that skips the whole scene. A pack of alternative theories, each heavier than the mystery it was built to light. And a handful of women whose word wouldn't have held up in any court in the empire, standing at the door of an empty grave, insisting. If you came for a proof, I don't have one to sell you, and I wouldn't trust anyone who did. What I have is a tomb that history can walk you right up to, and then at the threshold, history quietly sets down its instruments because it has reached the far edge of what it was ever built to measure. Whether you step through that door is not a question the manuscripts can answer for you. It never was. It's a question the empty space asks you. Here's something to take home and turn over. For the first 1,000 years, Christians almost never tried to paint the resurrection itself, the moment of rising. They knew better than to stage what no one saw. So when they wanted a picture of Easter, do you know what they painted? Not a glowing Christ bursting from the rock. They painted the women, coming to the tomb in the gray light, spices in their hands, leaning in to look at the impossible empty place. The oldest image the church has of its own central hope is not the triumph. It's the moment just before understanding, 3 faithful women at dawn looking into the dark, not yet knowing what they're seeing. Which is, if you think about it, a fairly honest portrait of faith itself. We are all of us those women, most days, leaning in, looking at an emptiness, deciding what to make of it. Women fled that first morning, Mark says, and said nothing, for they were afraid. But the sentence didn't end there, whatever Mark's torn scroll says, because you and I are sitting here 2,000 years on still talking about it. Somewhere off the edge of the page, the fear did not get the last word. And what happened next, who they met on the road and in the locked room and by the lake with the fire and the fish, well, that's a chronicle of its own, and it starts where this one leaves off. Same women. Same impossible morning, the door standing open. Come back for it.